Okay. Now I think we have given people the extra time to arrive. So I once again wish you welcome to the lecture. This is the first lecture of this autumn at the Norwegian Institute, and I will say a little bit more about our further plans after the lecture, but not in order to distract the attention now. We will move straight on to tonight's speaker, who is Stuart Robinson from the University of Tromsø. I asked if I could introduce him as the survivor of the Tromsø massacre, which is like a big a hot topic in Norway these days, because Tromsø has decided to cut a lot of programs. All while Stuart is here, so
yeah, they got away with it while I was here.
Yes. Yeah. Stuart is associate professor at the Department of Sociology, Political Science and Community Planning at Tromsø. He has his first degree from the UK, and then the following degrees from Canada, as I was. And then he wrote a PhD in political science at British Columbia on international or the politics of international crisis escalation. And he's been in Norway for some years now at this point, and has been he has written Constructing the Political Divide in Pre- and Postmodern Times, Enclaves, the Various and Changing Character of Rule. This is under publication, if I understand correctly. It's not yet out?
No.
No.
Yeah.
And then the thesis was published in 1996. So tonight he's going to speak on the Democratic Mirage, the Athenian model and contemporary practice. And this fits very well with something that we are trying to do more of here at the Institute nowadays, to not only focus on the ancient world, but more look at kind of how many of these patterns also continue into the present, or kind of to look more at modern Greece and look at places back and forth. So, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm very happy here to be here and do this talk, and then I think about the picture that I chose to start with, and I think maybe if it were a symposium, then I would have to maybe draw a line and say I'm not so sure about that, especially on a Wednesday night. This is an illustration of a symposium from some pottery from 420 BC. And the only reason I really picked this up, and by the way, as far as I understand it, the slave here is, this is the slave pictured in the middle, is helping the master with the business of throwing up. So it's an interesting choice of decoration for a piece of pottery, and may even have had certain sort of functional relationship to what it was depicting, but I can't confirm that. I would have to ask an archaeologist to help me with that, I think. But the reason I picked it out really was just as an illustration of this strange way that these, a lot of things that we sort of take from the ancient world are kind of riven from their context. They're kind of appropriated and used for different things. And this happens in the realm of language, but it also happens in the realm of, quite complex concepts that imply ideas, like, of course, the one in the subject of the talk today, which is democracy. So I want to say something about the way in which we appropriate the past, and I guess the difficulty I have with this, and one of the things I have to ask you to kind of, in a sense, bear with, is I'm making rather a general kind of argument here. I'm trying to say something about what we do in general. In some sense, I'm trying to talk a little bit about contemporary political culture and try and understand that from the point of view of the way our contemporary political culture deals with Athens as what is understood to be a very kind of important event, important set of practices in history. So I'm rather less concerned, say, for example, to talk about the way in which ancient Greek democracy is treated by historians, archaeologists from a particular kind of disciplinary perspective. If I come to this from a disciplinary perspective, it's my own. I'm looking at it from the point of view of somebody that does political studies, somebody that's interested in practices of politics. But I'm working to some extent with a kind of working assumption that there's quite a close connection between popular perceptions of the past, especially kind of the educated layperson's perception of the past, and the way that past is interpreted with respect to politics by my field. In some respects, it's my field that kind of educates people in how to understand ancient Greek democracy, for example. So, to that degree, what I'm talking about is something that's also talked about from the point of view, say, of the field of history, for example. I'm talking about a kind of a certain understanding of the idea of historicism, not to be confused with history or historiography. And historicism is used in different ways, and it is sometimes used to describe a certain kind of historiography, but I'm using it here in a sense in the good old-fashioned way of using isms, because the old-fashioned way of using ism was usually in a critical context, the way we use an ism when we talk about racism or parochialism. It's in some sense a kind of pathology of some kind. So I'm talking about historicism in one particular sense that's used, which is that we're inclined to interpret the past from the perspective of the present, and we allow our the prejudices of our own time and the concerns and the habits of thought and so forth of our own time distort what we see when we look at the past. Now, various scholars may be guilty of a certain kind of historicism, but I'm not directly interested in that. I'm more interested in the sense that out of this activity of interpreting the past, maybe I can argue there's a kind of broader cultural phenomenon that we can call a kind of historicist view of Athenian democracy, which is shaped by our contemporary political practice. I've been a little bit provocative and said, okay, perhaps we could call that a kind of mirage, that perhaps things aren't as democratic or wonderful as we might think. Perhaps not as wonderful in ancient Greece, and perhaps not even as wonderful in our own time as we may habitually assume. I want to suggest that there may be a problem with the way we think about democracy in two senses. One is that we may exaggerate the kind of democratic qualities of ancient Greece through a kind of selective interpretation of the past. And the other is that we may, in a sense, kind of overrate democracy itself. We may overrate democracy as, in some sense, being perhaps arguably one of the most important political values, but there are other political values beyond democracy. So there's two senses in which democracy could be kind of a problem, as well as something that we tend to perceive as good. So I want to talk about a certain kind of historicism. I've used inverted commas just to suggest that it's a particular idea of historicism, the idea that we distort the past through the lenses of the present. And what I want to focus on is what I think is the central problem there, which is a tendency to become, to focus too exclusively on form, too exclusively on procedure, which I would say is a tendency inherent in the idea of democracy, but which is one that perhaps arguably should be resisted, and to think a little bit more about the relationship between form and substance, or form and content, because maybe it matters the way in which a society operates. If we think about what politics is about making key decisions about how we operate socially. And if we look at that procedure and admire the procedure in isolation from how the broader society operates, that's a little bit problematic. Here's another scene from a symposium. And there are two ways of looking at this group, the kind of people that would take part in these symposia. Men only, a very privileged category of men. Men that, despite the fact that Athens is obviously often put up against other poli in ancient Greece as not being dominated by the wealthy to the same degree, Athenian citizens were relatively wealthy. Most of them would own slaves. They would be property owners. They were not. They were in a relatively small minority in the Greek city-state, and a privileged one that could be tended by slaves, over which they have almost complete power, even to the point that that absolutely unspeakably generous act of helping somebody while they're vomiting would be performed under duress by the slave. What I want to suggest is that we think a little bit more about this problem of emphasizing form at the expense of substance, which I think encourages this idea that we look away from these unfortunate aspects of Athenian society, the patriarchy, the oppression of slaves, and think of that as something peripheral and rather focus on the democratic ideals. I think that's a dangerous tendency, and it leads us away from what I think is a kind of constitutional thinking about politics, which I want to emphasize. Yeah, make a few kind of obvious points about the difficulty of studying the past or thinking about the past. starting from the obvious point that the past is the past is gone, and what we do as human beings in general, as practitioners of different disciplines, is we study traces that are left over from things that have gone before. We do that in terms as archaeologists, in terms of traces of artifacts, as historians might be emphasizing more accounts and documents. But whenever we're studying history, differences are questions of degree. We're always dealing with some kind of set of indirect indicators of something that happened before, which we have no direct possibility of observing. So I mean, even the word observation should be put in inverted commas, and I think there's a danger that we sometimes think we have a better access to things that have happened in the past than we really do. So we have a kind of selective apprehension necessarily of the things that have gone before. And because we have that rather partial picture, inevitably there's an imaginative, deductive kind of process involved. How do we try and reconstruct how things happened in the past on the basis of the limited material that we have at our disposal? And just to give a kind of an example of historicism that may be more or less familiar to most of you, the way in which we kind of visualize the art of ancient Greece. And that is through the kind of classical simplicity of marble objects. That is sort of almost a kind of central trope in the way we interpret the classical past. What we sort of know, nevertheless, from archaeological work, the fact that some of the rediscovered statuary from that time still has traces of the paint that was customarily put on these statues, that they were, as they were experienced in their time, they were typically brightly coloured in a kind of relatively naturalistic way. So this sort of imagery of the plain, beautiful white marble is in some sense a modern construction. And you can say, in a way, that this is a pretty classic, if that's the right word, example of historicism. Because what is it that appeals to us about thinking the Greeks appreciated their marble work in this way? It probably has something to do with a modernist attachment to simplicity of form, functionality, values which are more kind of modern probably than ancient Greek. So you can be kind of selective. I mean, you have objects, many objects from the past that don't have paint on them that appear to us in this way, but you may overlook the perhaps less immediately accessible traces of the past, like the half-faded paint, like the accounts we have of what was normal practice in terms of the role of these statues. The other thing, of course, is that they were of a relatively secondary nature anyway. The most important pieces of work from the Greek point of view were in bronze. But historicism is not just a sort of, a set of kind of pitfalls of misunderstanding that happen in some kind of neutral or random way. I would like to argue that the danger here from a political point of view is the way in which this kind of historicism can work towards a certain kind of agenda. And I put agenda in inverted commas here because I'm not suggesting there's some kind of deliberate, motivated action in a way either. It's not another conspiracy theory. There's far too many of those around these days. It's more the suggestion that there is a kind of certain ingrained tendencies, a way in which an agenda may emerge out of political structures, including habits of thought that could be a way of talking about what I mentioned at the beginning, a kind of contemporary political culture. And to understand that, I think what we have to remind ourselves is the more kind of prosaic roots of modern political practices. The formation of states in Europe out of pre-existing feudal relationships, and the development that was quite important in that process of breaking down those old feudal relationships of power and authority was the development of new institutions that were thought of as representative institutions. In England, for example, these were rooted in certain Anglo-Saxon processes that preceded, in many respects, feudalism. The old Anglo-Saxon Weetan, which is thought of as being the precursor of the more recent developments. When I say recent, 15th, 16th century development of parliaments. But these parliaments began as advisory bodies for kings, a way for kings to consult, especially with actors that were important financially. And this was part of an emerging political order in the transition from feudalism to modern states, where new revenues and new lines of control and administration were being developed with cities. And this is really the origin, say, of modern so-called democratic institutions in England, for example. Because the House of Commons, which is now understood as the kind of democratic institution where everyone in the country is allowed to vote for representatives, this was originally a body that could provide representation to a relatively new set of interests in the country, the rising merchant interests of the increasingly important towns. So those parliaments represented important burghers or burgesses, important not in anything approaching a kind of common franchise. This is something that came later. But in trying to make sense of these emerging institutions, writers, commentators, academics, and others have adopted a kind of language. They've looked to ancient Greece to provide a kind of language to make sense of what, back in the 15th century, was a relatively new institution. And of course the interest in thinking of this in democratic terms came later in the 19th to 20th century. But the looking for a kind of language that could be used to help with these new institutions, languages of authority and power and so forth, began quite early with the reappropriation of a kind of Greek history. what I would say happens with this appropriation of vocabulary is a certain kind of focus on form. How decisions are made, what is the procedure by which decisions are arrived at. And that starts to be understood as a form of indirect democracy, overlaid a sort of longer tradition of thinking in terms of representative government that's not necessarily thought of as having a kind of an affinity with that older democratic idea taken from Athens. So these are kind of relatively familiar ideas, I think, to most people, certainly people within the field of scholars and students within the field of politics. Periodic elections of representatives, relatively transparent deliberations. These arguably can be understood as a form of popular sovereignty. It certainly takes a certain kind of argument in terms of this relatively limited procedure of the periodic election that allows the possibility of withdrawing support for a set of representatives, that this is tantamount to a kind of ultimate popular sovereignty is quite a debatable case. At best it amounts to a kind of power of veto in extreme circumstances. The meaning, of course, is strengthened sort of historically by the gradual expansion of the franchise, commitment to a certain degree of liberal constitutionalism to wed the transparency to freedom of expression. And you could argue that the strengthening of that meaning is also helped by point of comparison, to say that this is a sort of pragmatic adaptation of an older, purer form of democracy that goes back to ancient Greece. And just to sort of not take too long to state the obvious, I mean, this idea is extremely current in our culture, and certainly the way in which, for example, the monuments of the Agora are presented is no exception. This is the site of the Agora Museum in the recreated Stoa of Attalus, which of course is a bit paradoxical because this was a much later Stoa, long after the classical age. But you go into the museum and the introductory plaque, which you find when you come in, says, among other things, the Agora was the heart of public life in the city. Here democracy was born and flourished. So there is a sense also in terms of the language, the sense of context as well, the grandeur of the classical housing of this. There is a sense in which, and to some degree a kind of effort to inspire awe in the kind of values that are being talked about. So we have this idea of a kind of cradle of democracy, even though modern representative government emerged from complex roots. There is a sort of simple trope here in a way. It began in Athens and it was continued later, and the complex history in between is maybe, it's certainly not unknown, but it's easily brushed over. And the comparison is what is understood also in procedural terms. In procedural terms that the citizens of Athens would gather together in an assembly to make important decisions. They would select representatives to carry out executive functions by lot. And this could be understood as a kind of popular rule, looking aside from the fact that this was quite a narrow definition of the public, women excluded, slaves excluded, non-Athenians excluded, foreigners that, free foreigners living in Athens. And you could have lived in Athens most of your life and you would still be defined as a foreigner because the grounds in which you could become a citizen were extremely restricted. But you have here a notion that this expresses principle of equality, it expresses a principle of freedom, and the grounds for doing that are wedded first and foremost to the procedures that are at work. And it's quite, I think this is, you see the kind of connection between the more kind of historically accurate representation of the symposium, the idyllic citizens with garlands in their hair. But of course, there are sort of issues with the degree of freedom. It's can be criticised from the point of view that it emphasises a political freedom, but other freedoms are limited, and they're limited by the ability of that assembly to decide all matters of importance. And if the assembly decides that it's threatened by a potential tyrant that could undermine the democracy, they may vote to ostracize that individual. These are the instruments of a secret ballot to effect that ostracization. Of course, we know that the assembly also tried and voted for the execution of Socrates for the crime of, first and foremost, of impiety. And then, of course, we can talk about the limits of that freedom from the modern point of view of thinking that there should be a domain of individual action that is left untouched, even if the collective is decided. And these concerns have been rehearsed quite regularly in the field of politics. De Tocqueville worries about the tyranny of the majority. John Stuart Mill worries about the tyranny of the majority. But rather less in the frame is the sense in which, whatever the kind of limits of these political values, they remain the kind of political values of a relatively narrowly defined elite. What kind of freedom do women in Athenian society have? What kind of protection do outsiders have? Any kind of student of ancient Greek history will know that wars within those city-states were long and brutal. And Athenians were not noted for the clemency with which they would handle their opponents. The most famous case, of course, is the siege of Milos that ended in the execution of the entire male population and the enslavement of anybody else. This, I think, is quite important because I think there's a kind of paradox at work here, and I think it's a paradox which helps us reflect a little bit more critically on our own political practice. There's a recent book that was written by Domenico Losurdo, was published in 2014, called Liberalism, a Counter-History. And he talks about the emergence of liberal values, the emergence of an attachment to democracy in Europe and the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. And what he argues there is an idea of a certain kind of pathos of freedom. The biggest advocates of rights of individuals, the biggest advocates of autonomy, principles like self-determination, were the relatively privileged. In fact, one of the most powerful liberal forces, liberal political forces in those narrow terms, were the great kind of slave owners of the American South, that saw no particular contradiction between the brutal exploitation of racialized slaves on their plantation and the fight for their individual liberties. And by pathos of freedom, trying to get at the way in which there is a treacherousness to these democratic values, that these democratic values can very easily have an unpleasant kind of flip side that is almost the predicating conditions of the very fine principles applied to what can be understood as a rather exclusive club, rather than being understood as an affirmation of more general human values. And of course, we may look at that and say we have the germ of democracy here, and say and look at this through another kind of Western trope of progress, and say yes, but we've moved on. But then we seem in a way to do parallel things, in terms of we laud the procedures that operate in an isolated context and ignore a lot of the oppression that goes on in other places, including, say, for example, the way employees may be treated in the business world. That is not considered to be part of the political domain, which again is a way in which we draw a kind of line around a set of procedures and exclude things which kind of interfere with a perception of the ideal. So what if we think about this a little bit more in terms of thinking about the relationship between form and content. In politics, some argue way to understand the practice of politics is that it's the relationship between authority and rules. Actors may gain a degree of authority, and they're able to establish relatively entrenched patterns of normative behaviour. In doing this, we establish various kinds of centres of decision making of various kinds, always of delimited scope of some form or another. It might be an argument about the limits of the authority of the Norwegian state or the Greek state, for example. It might be the limited decision-making scope of an association. It might be the limited decision-making scope of a corporation. But the central idea of politics doesn't necessarily say that politics is only those affairs that are delimited in a certain way. They're delimited in the way that we focus on what we have identified as states, what we have identified as the activities of governments. The way in which we separate out those activities as political, where others say relations between employers and employees, that's considered to be the private realm, the economic. The grounds for doing that are relatively historically specific. It's on the basis of the principle of sovereignty, which says that there is a higher realm of law and a lower private realm of relations between citizens. That dual structure we almost take to be a kind of natural given, but it would have been completely incomprehensible, for example, in feudal times. At the same time, in broader terms, there are social structures that may constrict the freedom that operates in those various decision-making structures, decision-making centres. And to some extent, those structures are also the product of a kind of an accumulation of decisions and practices of the past. So we may focus in a kind of spatial and temporal snapshot on a set of decisions and laud this as an expression of freedom, and yet these may have been shaped and circumscribed in important ways. This becomes extremely obvious if we look at the products, say, of the decisions of the ancient Greek Athenian assembly, for example. There are certain kinds of decisions that were completely unthinkable. The emancipation of slaves, the admission of women to the assembly, anything that could be considered to be impious. All kinds of very well established rules and norms passed through various institutional structures that ultimately constrict that freedom that may, from a narrow formal procedural point of view, look quite impressive. And part of this is to think about those centres of decision making less in isolation from one another. And I think from the point of view of understanding ancient Greece and also our own practice, the general idea of thinking about the connections between these areas rather than focusing on one or looking at them in relative isolation is quite important. The image of the kind of emancipated bastion of freedom and equality, looking at the assembly in isolation, looks a bit different if you focus on the household as another important domain of authority and definition of rules, where the male head of household is the complete unmediated dictator with complete, almost complete power over life or death of those that are there, be they women or slaves. And I think this is one of the ways we undermine, another way of thinking about this, thinking about it as a democratic mirage, or thinking about it as a democratic facade in some way. Another way is to think about the danger of being governed by political caricatures. The caricature that oversimplifies, that creates a kind of distorted and exaggerated view. So we have this, view of Sparta as bad and Athens as good. And yet, if you look at Sparta more in in broader, more political, economic terms, rather than thinking of it in terms of narrow procedural terms, Sparta starts to look quite a bit better, for instance, certainly in terms of the role that women were allowed to play, which was, in those terms, more progressive. Also in terms of attitudes to outsiders. It's noticeable that at the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, the Athenian city was not destroyed. The Athenian citizens were not put to death. If we base the record of Athens earlier in that war, it's not clear that we could have, if Athens had won the Peloponnesian War, that we could have expected them to show the same kind of mercy. But we follow from the rhetorical statements of the famous Pericles, we are called a democracy, for the administration is in the hands of the many and not the few, with equal justice to all alike in their private disputes. And of course, whether administration is hands of the many or the few depends on your point of perspective, is kind of the important point to emphasize. And think about structures, as mentioned. Think about this in terms of culture, a civic religion that placed very clear guidelines in terms of what is or isn't allowed, created rites and rituals that reinforce a sense of identity that is, I would say, above anything else, a kind of warrior or identity. I mean, the image we tend to take with us is the kind of philosopher identity. But the Athenians, of course, also gave us the idea of sophistry, the idea that philosophers could do the unthinkable. They could question the beliefs that are passed down to, or the behaviours that are passed down by means of religion. And this reflects a kind of broader social context, the centrality of war to the economic life of the polis. The war was a kind of natural element of life, and I don't think that it's necessarily coincidental that the religious rites have a heavy emphasis on the slaughter of animals, the bloodletting, which is also, of course, a part of the relationship with the non-Athenians, that may also be an important source of labour in the Athenian economy. Likewise, in the view of our own practice, we focus especially on the state as the kind of site of decision making. Less comfortable with the intergovernmental forums that are often not transparent in the way laid down by a kind of model of modern democratic representative government, and also heavily influenced by the decisions of corporations, particularly over the everyday lives of a great number of people. Structures of our own tied up with nationalism, capitalist culture of what C.B. Macpherson called a kind of possessive individualism. So what I would argue for is thinking about this in a more self-consciously constitutional way, and there are different ways of thinking about constitutionalism. One is a highly legalistic one, but there's a longer tradition of constitutional thought that has us think a little bit more explicitly about who we are actually. What is the domain, the proper domain from the point of view of our moral and political decisions? And rather than taking that for granted, here is the body politic. Of course, I'm from Norway, I'm from Greece. The body politic is my own nation. There are other possibilities. The possibilities of a sense of solidarity with humanity in general. There's a possibility of solidarity in any number of domains, not just the overtly or conventionally political. All forms of human life together involve a degree of collaboration for the common good, or for that matter for the creation of common goods. Perhaps those are appropriate domains of reflection in terms of how we apply our political values. And maybe if we look at Athens more in a holistic way, maybe we're able to look at our own practices and our own society in a more holistic way as well. And I will leave it at that and say thank you very much.